Okay, there is a quorum in the room. I invite members of the committee to take their seats at the committee table so we can get started. Questions to staff? Seeing none? Okay, Councillor Ragline.
I just really have one question at this point. I may have others as colleagues chime in, but one of the gentlemen, and I'm sorry we had a lot of presentations this morning, mentioned a committee that had been in place that had, in his opinion, had worked well. Yes, you right there. Yeah. You came back. Good for you. And it's not there anymore. So maybe you could talk about what the rationale was behind it not being there, and whether you think it makes sense to maybe bring it back or some form of it back as you proceed.
Yes, Madam Chair, we had an interdepartmental committee that was comprised of representatives from most departments across the City of Ottawa. Following the realignment and the shrinking of the senior leadership team, we have an opportunity to basically have discussions and be more informed on all of the different portfolios. So I can assure committee that since this new realignment, that we've had an opportunity at the senior leadership team to have a fulsome discussion about housing and the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. What we've also, so there's a familiarity across the senior leadership team in terms of the issues and the opportunities going forward and the work that needs to be done. What we've also done is we're engaging with each department individually, those that were listed by Ray, specifically people like real estate. We also have an upcoming meeting with public health, planning. We also have a transit-oriented meeting coming up that's being organized. Go ahead.
We're currently working with planning to develop a forum to examine providing affordable housing around rapid transit stations on April 20th. Yes.
So what it allows us to do, when we had the interdepartmental committee, it was more broad because there were so many people coming to the table. Now what we're doing is we're having specific conversations. So for example, we had a full half day with real estate, and we talked about the needs not only in housing but across the entire department, and we developed a work plan specifically to real estate. And we're going to continue to do that work as we go forward, and that work plan will then obviously complement the work that's underway. So I think this model will work as well, if not better, because people will be that much more informed, and there's more rigor and intent around developing work plans that will link to and contribute to the outcomes in the plan.
Okay, thank you for that. And on related, one of the other Wendy Muckler had suggested that we need to be better at consultation or gaining feedback from our clients, in effect. I'm wondering if you could weigh in on that, what you think of that, and how you might be able to implement something like that.
As part of the development of a 10-year plan, we did go out and consult with people with lived experience, people on the wait list, people who were homeless. We're going to continue to go through those various forums and consultation mechanisms that work. We have done surveys in the past. We have had focus groups with these folks in the past. From all the different sectors, and I'm going to just turn it over to Shelley to talk a little bit about how we engage them in terms of their specific needs when we talked about when we do those the common assessment tool, and how that feeds into choice and responding to their specific needs.
Madam Chair, yes, certainly through the SPDAT assessment, where we're assessing people in the shelters, it looks at a variety of different life domains and how well they're functioning, and it gives the opportunity for the person who's administering the tool and the person who's providing the answers to have a real dialogue about what do they think they need, what kind of services they would like, where would they like to live, and all of that information, not just the score on that assessment, comes to housing services. So we know right off the bat on our by name list what people's housing preference choices are, for instance. We've also included at different points in times, we have a community advisory board that provides advice and guidance to us on how we use our federal homelessness funding. And we've had clients, people with lived experience, participate on that committee also.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, is now the time to also have a question for Councillor Taylor to put that forth? Okay. So I'm going to call you Mark, if that's okay. Thank you for your work on this. Obviously, we just got it, so I haven't had a chance to go through it. But one of the recommendations that I found interesting was the potential or the possibility of buying existing homes out there on the market and paying the mortgage, if you will, through the rents, so the city would buy the homes. So I guess I have a two-part question for you in that regard. One is, where would we get the funding to do that? Would we be diverting funding from an existing program, or do you think that that's a new funding ask, if you will? And secondly, how do we message that, if you will, in the sense that we have a lot of families out there that are not homeless per se, but I'll call them the working poor, and they're trying to put together their down payment to get a home as well. And so how would you, what process do you envision would be in place to determine who might be the beneficiary of such a program like that versus somebody, what would your cutoff be, or what would your criteria be? And maybe, and I apologize, maybe it's in the report, doesn't have a chance to read it, but that's sort of the two-part question.
Thanks very much, Councillor Eglai. Appreciate that. I guess, in looking at that recommendation, there was a couple of different thoughts that came forward in discussions with community partners and also folks who have had lived experience looking for affordable housing. There's a number of ways you could approach that. I think, first of all, the good news is that the city already had a program to provide for down payments, and I think Said can probably tell me what year that was. It was 2013, 14?
Trying to remember when we started, but we had various programs from about approximately 2008 up until the end of 2013. Yeah.
So the model already kind of exists. The problem was, although it was successful, it wasn't heavily funded. And there was some concern, obviously, around the optics of that, helping people buy houses. Is that the business the city should really be in? But when you look at other successful models, organizations like Habitat for Humanity, and you look at our own arm's-length agencies like Ottawa Community Housing, Ottawa Community Housing and a lot of social housing providers use at or near market rent paying individuals to try and balance their portfolios. But there's also, a subset of people who are in affordable housing right now who are, for want of a better word, house blocking. They're the folks that we used to refer to in the medical system as being bed blockers. They would love to be able to own their own home. They're, employed, they're gainfully working, they're great members of the community, but they'll never be able to save up the money for a down payment. But helping them through some type of mechanism to get into a scenario where they own their own property, even if we need to support them for a little while in doing so, allows us to both free up that affordable housing unit and place them in a situation where now it's not a systemic kind of intergenerational, the next generation is going to be in affordable housing as well, potentially, but where you have an asset at the end of the line. The presenter talked about tiny homes. She said, look, even if I had an asset at the end of the line, even if it wasn't big, it would help me. There'd be a little bit of equity there. So there's a couple of different models we can explore using. From what I've looked at, I think working with some kind of partnership between Ottawa Community Housing and Habitat for Humanity is a good place to start.
But going back, so where does the funding come from? Because it sounds like the initial attempts at this failed because there weren't enough dollars there.
Yeah, so certainly require funding. Now, some of the good news is that the federal funding that's coming, the stuff that has less strings tied to it, we've had conversations with Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation about who's really kind of the agent, I suppose, with respect to the federal, a lot of the federal programs that are coming down. And they are open to having the discussion about this kind of program. So our colleagues over at CMHE have said, look, If you can come up with some kind of innovative model and they're prepared to sit down and work with us on what that might look like, then they see it as being a potential candidate for funding.
Thank you, Councillor Eglin. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, big thank you to staff for your report and for your immersion in this subject, your commitment to this subject. I know it probably some comments today that were hard to hear, but I've never second-guessed your commitment to this particular item that the city is trying to address, and I just want to thank you first and foremost. And to our colleague, Councillor Taylor, thank you as well for your work on your report as well, which I will be reading very soon. I'm going to try and keep my comments sort of high level. We can spend quite a while getting into some very specifics, but I just want to give you sort of my high level comments and questions. In the staff report, you listed a number of challenges, very real challenges. You talked about aging social housing stock, which is very true. Increased demand for housing. The availability and affordability of the stock itself. The adequacy of housing for people on fixed incomes, the emerging and complex needs, and the decreasing of federal funding for social housing programs. All very real, all very scary. You talked about some opportunities as well. It would be really great from my perspective if, as part of your report, for the very serious challenges you've identified, what the plan is, or what the possible options and plans are to identify those. There are some good initiatives underway for some of these items, but I think the challenges are very real. And I think these are reasons why we'll have a very difficult time achieving the end to homelessness by 2024, because we need to be very real about what those challenges are and have a plan to have those addressed. We talked about the root causes of homelessness, and again, a report like what you've tabled today would be very good and beneficial for me. See, I see this as we're triaging at the very end, right? People don't have a home, and we are, as a municipality, desperately trying to get them off the street or out of a shelter. And yet, there are many factors that have contributed to why they've got there to begin with. No one's disputing this. It's kind of like when I was a trustee and we talked about what are reasons why kids are on the road for failure. One option is to hire more teachers. But that is not the reason why those kids are going down that path. You have to try and understand what all those root causes are and try and put your resources into those root causes. And so if we're going to have a staff report that follows this at some point, I think for me it's helpful to talk about, all right, here are some of the contributing factors that lead to homelessness, and here's how the city in particular is trying to address some of those root causes to mitigate the numbers that come at the end, because it's very expensive to address the issue at the end. That's right. When someone's arriving in cardiac arrest at the hospital, they have to be treated, but it'd be great to, from the time they're 5, get them in the active program and gym and all that good stuff. But anyway, so no one's disputing poverty issues, lack of education, employment opportunities, mental health issues. But I think that contributes to a more fulsome report when we talk about those as well. Do we know the number of people who are homeless when this 10-year period began? Is there an actual metric in the report? I'm not sure if I saw a number, but at the beginning of 2014, how many people in Ottawa were officially homeless? And given this is an update after 4 years, how many people are homeless? I did see the gender numbers. I'm not sure if that's the metric what we're using, but I just wanted you to comment on that.
Yes, certainly, Madam Chair. Certainly when the 10-year plan started, if we looked at the total number of unique people who utilized an emergency shelter over the course of the year, in 2014 it was 6,502 people. At the end of 2017, that has grown to 7,530 people. So it is also in this staff report on page 20.
So, Councillor Taylor's report has a number of recommendations. How does your report and his report, how do they get married? Like what happens after today? I mean, really, we're getting a status update, but I'm just as interested in how to make significant improvements from this point on. We've heard a lot of good feedback today, a lot of good suggestions. I saw you writing stuff down. After the dust settles, how do we move forward after today to make sure there is a realistic plan to end homelessness within 6 years, less than 6 years?
Madam Chair, I'm just going to echo with what Councillor Taylor just said. We have to date for a while first. So there's a lot of good information in there. There was extremely robust consultation. Shelley and I were involved in some of those, so we're aware of some of the discussion around some of these things. Some of these were shared with us as well. But like yourselves, we haven't had a chance to fully comprehend and understand all the context in there. So we're going to continue to look at that, and any consideration will be given to every single recommendation, and will form part of the discussions and the consultation that we'll be having going forward over the coming year to inform the refresh plan. And certainly, if there's anything that we can implement in the meantime within the existing resources and in consultation with the partners, we will certainly do that. But at this point, it's a bit premature in terms of being able to speak specifically about how they would align, but they certainly will inform the refresh plan.
So can you just remind the committee and myself how much time there is between receipt or the tabling of your report today, the reception of Councillor Taylor's report, the amount of time you need to digest and absorb what is being recommended? You said you're going out for another round of consultations, but is this committee going to receive another report or your battle plan within X number of months? When is that exactly going to be retabled?
So Madam Chair, so the consultation that needs to take place for the midpoint review will start in 2018 and go over into 2019, because we have a lot of consultation to do. So we've heard a lot of great ideas here today that people would like to share with us. So certainly we'd be anticipating about bringing a report back sometime in 2019, I would say later spring. And we can also take the recommendation in Councillor Taylor's report and also consult more broadly, with those particular recommendations. And at that point in time, we'll also have a better idea of some of the funding we may receive through the National Housing Strategy. So we'll also see, what's financially feasible to implement within our budgets.
Thank you for that. So, Madam Chair, just for now, my final question is, the federal government funding that they're reducing, you quoted, we've gone from 32 million to 28, and I believe their goal is to make it zero. What is their rationale for that funding decrease?
Well, Madam Chair, sorry. Always forget. The rationale is that the federal operating agreements are tied to mortgages, right? So as mortgages expire, the operating dollars that are attached to those mortgages expire along with it. So, we have seen that decline, as mentioned, from 32 million to 28 million, and now starts to drop off more precipitously starting this year moving forward. We have heard some strong commentary that the federal government is looking to backstop that funding, but they've been a little bit light on details so far.
But in the meantime, the City of Ottawa taxpayers have to make up that gap. Either we haven't committed to raising taxes, but basically we're deciding to backstop that withdrawal of federal funds, and we're not doing other projects that we could be doing. But ultimately, the city has to take over that funding decrease.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Newsbaum.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff too, and to Councillor Taylor for the materials this morning. Actually, my questions build on what Councillor Brockington was just speaking about, and I guess where the question is coming from is, I'm wondering whether, having established what I think are very ambitious targets back in 2013. I think they were the right targets. They were ambitious targets. I'm wondering whether, maybe the first question to Janice and her team is, have you articulated at this stage what it's going to take to get there? So we've got the targets. We know what we want. The plan is very clear. Almost working backwards, if we want to imagine a future council in 2024 cutting the ribbon on ending homelessness and cutting the ribbon on limiting shelter stays to 3 weeks, working backwards from that point, do we know what it's going to take to get there? Has that been outlined, figured out, articulated by your team? And this isn't a gotcha question. I mean, I'm just trying to understand, and I'll have a follow-up question once you've answered that.
So at this point, we do not. So when we contemplated the initial plan, it was, as you said, ambitious, and it was difficult to know what kind of resources, what kind of changes. We didn't even contemplate Housing First at the time. So it's been, while the priorities haven't changed, the actions within the plan certainly have, and each time they have, we've come back to committee and council on those things. I think we have a really more concrete idea now in terms of what it takes to build supportive housing, what it takes to fund it for the health needs as well as the ongoing operating. So when we look at the whole gamut, including the shelters and all the rest of it, I think we would be very much in a position to be able to say, for this outcome, this is what kind of investment we would be needing. So, this is what we think we'll be able to achieve. And if you want to accelerate that, it would be X million, X million, X million. I think we'll be much better positioned to be able to identify that. And a lot of the work and the study and the data that we've been accumulating in the last 4 years would be able to inform that. So I would think, looking at this team here, that we would be able to provide that those specific numbers with linked to each one of the targets that we would set.
And that's something that you're imagining you would do as a follow-up from this report or in advance of the midterm review next year? What's your anticipated?
I would see it as part of the midpoint review.
Okay. I think that would be extremely useful. And the reason is that I think it's important for council, having established the target, to understand that, it's easy for us to sit around and say we want to end homelessness, right? That's the easy part. The hard part, and the part where I think we really want honest and courageous advice from you, is you have to say to us, council, you've said you want to end homelessness. Now, here's our analysis of what we think it will take. And I suspect, and you could gather it from my questions earlier to some of the guest speakers, that we can't do it with existing funding. And I think it's going to be important for you to be able to tell us, if you want to end homelessness, this is what it's going to take in terms of a dollar figure, in terms of some of the efficiencies we've talked about. And then I think it's our job to say, well, geez, that's a really big number. We've got to go figure out from the province and the feds how we're going to do that. And am I not right that the province has also established an ending homelessness target around the same year? Is it 2024 as well? Yes?
Yes, 2025.
Right. So, I think what it does is it arms us so we can go to Queen's Park and say, look, you want to end homelessness. What our staff are telling us is to do that in Ontario, it's going to take X. And we don't have X. We have X minus a significant delta. And then I think the political level of all three levels of government have to make a decision whether we're actually willing to dedicate the effort and the energy and the resources that you tell us it's going to take to end homelessness in this city. So just to say, I think that's a really important step, and I'm very grateful to hear that that's going to be part of your midterm process. My second question gets at some of the issues that we heard our speakers talk about this morning. They were talking about some best practices in other municipalities within Ontario. I must admit I don't know enough about those to be able to comment intelligently about them. But I'm wondering, there was a bit of a repeated suggestion that we could do a better job of sort of understanding how we're doing on Housing First. There was mention of fidelity assessments. Councillor Leeper asked some questions related to that. what's your take on that? Are those issues? Are there some valuable ideas there that either you're planning on following through on, or you think it would be useful for further discussion? What's your assessment of whether we have the right data set in terms of evaluating how we're doing, and whether there are best practices that we as a city can benefit from other jurisdictions from?
Madam Chair, I think there's always best or promising practices that we can take from other municipalities. Certainly there's, I would say, some of the communities out west who are definitely leaders in implementing Housing First. So I do think there's always lessons to be learned. I can tell you that we do have a robust and extensive Housing First program. We have about $9.9 million invested in it. We have not done a formal fidelity assessment, which people talked about the Pathways Fidelity Assessment. We do a modified fidelity assessment every year with Employment and Social Development Canada. It's a requirement of the funding we receive from them. We are committing to doing the Pathways model of fidelity assessment through the operational review that we're going to undertake of the Housing First program. We actually use a system called the Homeless Individuals and Families Information System to track our data around housing and homelessness. We have the largest data set across Canada, so we're leaders in that regard. We also have a by name list, similar to what was spoken about earlier. We just use a different database to track ours. Ours is an access database. So we have all the key components in place that are necessary for a Housing First program, which are diversion, assessment, coordinated access, case management supports. You know, we partner with some of the agencies that were here today talking about Housing First. You know, CMHA is a strong partner of ours. We fund 9 positions with them through our City Housing First program. So, you know, we're having great outcomes. 519 chronically homeless single people have been housed since we started in April of last year. So I do think that our program is working, and we have true fidelity to many, many components of the fidelity assessment. Certainly there's always improvements in any program. We've recently increased our housing allowance so that people have the affordability that they need for us to get to true fidelity of the program.
Okay, I'll leave that question there. I just got one last question, Madam Chair, and that is related to the target in the original 2013 plan. I'll just read it out. Achieve 40% savings in funding from emergency shelters by 2024, and the goal was to see those savings reinvested into prevention. And I know, Shelley, you mentioned in your presentation that the challenge is that the per diems are coming from the province. And it's not as easy, I think you were saying at the start, to say, okay, we're going to take the per diems and shift those into a RET supplement of some kind. Yet, I think we're all aware of the numbers. We all know that shelter stays are an expensive solution to this problem. But in light of the target, and in light of the complex funding streams involved, what is, I'm asking you the million-dollar question, what is the pathway then to achieving this target of 40% savings? If the idea that the per diems are coming from the province, we want the province to say, hey, actually, we'd rather have that money for prevention. Are we anywhere near the 40% savings? If not, do we have a plan for how we're going to shift from that expensive? We saw Mr. Bartlett show the motel figures. How do we get there? How do we start shifting and making those savings that we said we would try and do in our original 2013 plan?
Madam Chair, so we did achieve about $1 million of savings through implementing our various programs under the 10-year plan in 2015. You know, the demand is really what's creating the issues for us right now. You know, we put all these effective programs and processes in place, and we're moving people out into housing, but at the same time, you're moving 10 people and 20 people are behind calling in. So it's really trying to get a handle on the demand. And we've chosen to be a city that's warm and welcoming, and we provide safe shelter for everybody who's in crisis and need. So it's It's a significant issue. I mean, we do have a lot of families in motels, for instance, but I didn't speak to the fact that with those families in motels, we actually moved 542 families through our family shelter system in 2017, which is about 1,700 individuals. So we are making progress. It is challenging right now. We would like to convert that money into housing, into support services and certainly on the prevention end. But to be able to have a real impact right now, I did a little bit of math earlier. If I was to take everybody that was in a hotel right now, I'd need about $2.1 million in new funding for ongoing subsidies to move them out into the community. And then we'd have to hope that there weren't 300 people behind them knocking on the door.
Right. But I guess the simple way of looking at this would be to say, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones and their 2 children require housing, and right now the province is spending $3,000 a month putting them up in a motel on Montreal Road or wherever, of course, where one's mind goes is, well, can't we ask the province to, instead of spending the $3,000 on the motel fees, spend the $1,800 on a rent supplement, and the savings would be there. But obviously it's not that simple. Is it the province that says, no, this is a per diem envelope, and we're not going to permit these shifts because we're afraid of what's coming behind Mr. and Mrs. Jones? Is that the issue?
Madam Chair, the province right now has just actually set rules and the program guidelines for that particular funding stream. It's called the Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative. So it says that funding that's using to pay per diems or cannot be turned into ongoing housing subsidies, rent supplements, or housing allowances. So it's actually a program rule. It does say you can do it in the short term and you have to do a business case, but you have to exhaust all your other funding sources. So it would be something that we could take back to the province and say, this isn't working for us this way, and see whether we can affect some change that way.
Certainly an issue to follow up. I'll stop there. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, can I just offer, I just want to try and connect 2 points that Councillor Nussbaum and Councillor Brockington had raised about the data sets, and we heard that over and over and over again. Janice and Shelley and her team, the staff team, have done an outstanding job. They spoke about the data set they have with HIFIS and the data that comes from the SPDAT tool on the shelter intake. But there is an unexplored, I think, opportunity to try and bridge that a little further, whether we use kind of an epidemiological model to get to what Councillor Brockington was talking about, which is there's the incidences of homelessness, predictors of homelessness. Where does that come from, right? So everything right now, as much as we've enlarged the partnerships, still operates under kind of a housing and homelessness bubble. It doesn't extend beyond that necessarily too far into other social service agencies, other deliverers of care. So there's an opportunity there where, without getting too big brother about it, we have the opportunity to perhaps look at some of the front-end investments that we could make at diversion, talk a little bit about housing loss prevention, strengthening that arm of the system to try and defray some of the costs that we're experiencing on the back end.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais débuter par remercier tous les gens qui sont venus ce matin. Puis j'aimerais remercier le secteur du logement qui dans des conditions historiques, font leur possible à ce qu'ils ont présentement. Puis aussi Janice et toute l'équipe là devant pour... je sais que vous travaillez souvent dans des situations d'urgence, puis on vous demande de penser à plus long terme, donc c'est pas toujours évident. And I want to also thank my colleague, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Taylor also sits with me on Ottawa Community Housing, and obviously we know the importance of housing. And I live some of the operational challenges from our shelters and some of the housing needs in our city, but certainly having a fulsome interview process. There's a lot of content to absorb in that, and there's a lot of opportunity. So thank you for that. My questions are to staff, basically, and they refer to going back, what the sense that I'm getting, and we can talk about funding and stuff like that, but the reality is the province and the feds will have their programs, and that will define what their priorities are. And that will have local impacts in Ottawa. What I'm not hearing or what I'm not seeing is, what is the City of Ottawa's priorities? So how can we, it's not casse-tête, it's a puzzle to me. So we have two pieces, the province and the feds, who are coming with funds and are going to continue to, especially with the national housing policy, will frame something around that. But the puzzle piece that I cannot clarify is, if the province and the feds, they can't do a national program for every municipality that works. So there's local priorities that we need to fund, that we need to prioritize. And in the first term, when we were prioritizing $4 million a year on capital, I kind of saw that trend. I saw where we were going. And then, that number kind of changed, and over time, I understand where we are today, but can you define to me forget the federal and provincial program, what's the Ottawa priority? I get lost in that. And I'm in the I'm chair of Ottawa Community Housing, and I get lost as to what is the city's priority with all the, the other factors.
It's going to sound repetitive, but the priorities are the three that we outlined at the beginning of the 10-year plan, where everyone has a home, the stock's in a good state of repair, people get the supports they need. That includes, shelters that respond adequately, and we work together so that we have economies of scale and we're being effective and efficient. All of those, and below each one of those, there are targets and expectations. When we get the money from the federal government and the provincial government, while they do have some guidelines and some requirements, we use that funding to meet our specific needs. And so the perfect example of that is supportive housing. When the province provides us with IH funding, it does not say go out and build supportive housing. That is our priority. That's specific, and it feeds all the way through our plan. If we can gain some savings from people in shelters, which is what we want to do, then we can reinvest it into prevention. So where we have every opportunity to use our funding, as well as the federal and provincial government, it's to meet the needs that we identified together as a sector. And we can't say, for example, let's build new construction if we get repair money, but we know there's a huge, you would know that we have a huge repair gap in Ottawa Community Housing and the other providers. So if that's the funding we get, it goes towards that specific outcome and priority. And these are not a large number. They're very specific, and they're not. There's not an infinitesimal amount of them. They're very specific, and the funding that we goes directly to improving those in those specific areas. And one of the big ones, obviously, that we're talking about is ending chronic homelessness. So every resource that we can use is towards those outcomes.
Okay. I want to talk for my questions really are the next range are really relating to data and how to make the data speak. So the tool that we have that captures the data, my understanding is the SPDAT tool. How does that refer to other housing providers or other municipalities in Ontario and nationally? What data tool do they use to know who's in the system and how do we properly house folks?
So many Madam Chair, many communities across Canada use the HIFA system, the Homeless Individuals and Families Information System. It's primarily used to book people in and out of shelters, but there's a lot of demographic information that's in there, and we're also moving to a web-based version of this tool very shortly. So that's used across Canada. A few other communities have developed their own homelessness management information system. I believe Calgary and Toronto have created their own systems. The SPDAT tool is simply just an assessment tool, and that data comes to housing services, and we only use that data to prioritize and match people. And case managers use it ongoing as a tool to check in with people to see are their needs decreasing. So the tool is actually re-administered at various intervals once somebody is housed. Just on another note, the city is collaborating with 8 other organizations or municipalities across Ontario to develop another tool called the Housing Collaborative Initiative. It's a web-based software that will be used for the administration of social housing and affordable housing post-development. So it's going to replace an aging system, and it will have things like a centralized waitlist model, rent supplement model, financial asset models, etc.
So today, thank you for that. So today, like, if we were to, do we know, like, last night, how many people slept in family shelters, in hotels, and in our different shelters around the city? Immediately, we have that statistics on a daily basis?
Madam Chair, yes, we do.
And so the individual that's behind that, not the individual that's behind the technical, but behind that number, is that individual properly identified? Because there was some issue that was related by some of the speakers earlier, this by name component, which I'm intrigued in. So that to me means that someone is tracked in the system, but they're not tracked by who they are. They're just tracked by age, gender. Maybe you can tell me more.
Yes. So once the SPDAT assessment is administered, that individual's name and information and some basic demographics, housing choice, and their acuity score comes to Housing Services, and we then use that. That's the by name list. It's what we call the coordinated access function. So it comes to Housing Services, and we use that by name list. So we know that Shelley Van Buskirk's 10th on that list, and she's going to be the 10th person to be matched to a case manager in our Housing First program based on my needs and how long I've been in the shelter system. So that's what the by name list is.
And so, again, we'll use Shelley as the example here. So Shelley's been in shelters for over 90 days. Your priorities already identified as the triage, or the acuity triage has been done as well. So then what happens to the individual once they're housed? So they're off that list, they're off the priority list, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is that loop back. If that person loses housing within 3 years, let's say, and they're back into a priority context, how does that fit into the algorithm?
So when people are housed, they're housed with ongoing supports with a case manager, and they provide practical supports. That case management supports last until people are ready to graduate from the program, and that depends on the individual. Some people may just need support in their housing for 6 months, others 12, others 18 months.
I respect that. Not to interrupt. What I'm concerned about is Shelley Van Buskirk, who's now housed, who loses that unit for reason XYZ, who's back on a shelter list. Do we know that without, obviously there might be people that know and worked with Shelley in the past, but do we know in the system that this is a person that was already housed, was already under a priority, and that's coming back?
Yes, we would.
No matter the gap there, no matter the amount of years?
So if I graduate from the program at 9 months, the case management agency that was working with me, I can reconnect with them for a period of about 12 months or so to provide, so they can continue to provide supports. If they leave and I'm in my housing for 2 years, I destabilize, I go back to the shelter, I will be triaged within 72 hours with that assessment tool again. And because I've already had an attachment to housing, our goal would be to get me rehoused as quickly as possible.
Okay. I have 2 more questions. I want to know, so how many families did we have in shelters last night in Ottawa, including hotels and motels? I think the number's around 180. I might be wrong, but asking over the last month or so, that's what I've gotten in number.
Madam Chair, so are you asking for the capacity just in hotels or through the whole system?
Families and shelters. So families that are not housed, that we have to find options for. They're already they might be in a motel or a hotel. They might be at Ford Avenue. They might be. How many of those do we have?
It's approximately 300.
300. And we know that the average is around 5 months.
I think families may be staying a little bit longer than 5 months these days.
So let's be conservative. So take the number 300 and times it by, the average hotel night, which is $110, and then time it by the amount of days that equates to, and that's a lot of money. That's in the $1 million range. That's probably $5 million. I haven't done the stats, but just quickly in my mind. So that's what I don't understand of the system. We're able all of a sudden to unlock funds which provide emergency response to those that we want to house. How come we're not able to unlock that money and say, we're going to get rent subs, we're going to get housing first, we're going to go into social housing, we're going to work with private, and take that, like with $5 million over 5 months, whoa, we could make a massive dent. That's what I don't get, is like, can't we just parallel an amount of money for a period of time and actually fix that backlog?
So ultimately, that is the intent of the plan, is to continue to reduce how much money is going into emergency response, into housing, prevention, and supports. I think a lot of folks who spoke out today said that part of the system, we have to include shelters. So if we subsidized everybody that left the shelter today, they would need that subsidy. The subsidy is of a rent supplement is about $660 a month. We would have to continue to provide that $660 to that family for as long as they would need it. What would happen and if you recall, a lot of the discussion today was about, we have 55,000 families living in poverty, and we have 24,000 options. And we have newcomers, we have people who destabilize. So if we take all that, we could unlock that funding, and it would follow everybody, and we would have nothing remaining for the people who then...
Let me ask you a question. If today we had double the amount in families, would we be able to unlock the funds to put them in hotels?
So the
No, but it's a short answer. It's a yes or no answer.
We would be coming back to committee and council, as we have done in the past, and saying that we have more money in families and in motels and the family shelters, and it's going to cost the city.
So my point is, when I hear from the community on where the leadership is, that's where the gap is. That's what the community is asking about, is saying, how come on a day-to-day you can unlock funds and put people in shelters? Where does that pot of money come from? It seems endless, but you can't transfer that into a permanent option. That's what I don't get. That's what I don't understand in the system. We're seeing pressures in families, and we know that that's low-hanging fruits. That families, a lot of them are newcomers, refugee immigrants. They're not housed. They're not housed. Those kids are not going to school for periods of 6 months. Then we're transferring them across the city. We're finding them a unit. We're not giving that family a chance, right? And that, to me, is where I'd like to go. In my mind, and Janice, I know you'd love to answer, but to wrap up the committee conversation from my end, it's the following: is at the last committee we had the report from our Indigenous community, and of that we had a housing component. I believe that Shelley and her team is heading in the right direction with provincial and federal talks on the urban Aboriginal funding for housing. So I don't need to talk about that today. I see the youth numbers dropping, and I'm confident with the funds that went to the YSB that that's going to continue to drop. So I'm confident of that. Where I'm concerned is the conversation we've had around shelters, and it doesn't relate specifically to the Salvation Army on Montreal Road. It specifies that right now the shelters are becoming very equipped with services. You think of Inner City Health, you think of other providers, and when we house someone, then the services that they need, you can't attach it. That it be an OCH, that it be an CCOC, you lose that service. So we have to be very careful at this committee and as governments to over-service the shelter world, because you become a stopgap where people can't be housed. They don't have the service when they're housed to make sure that they're successful tenancies. That's one of the points. But the second point is, if there is one priority that we really need to unlock and change the model, and every stone unturned, internal working groups, get the thing going, is on families. And when I see that number go up, it is tragic. It is tragic for all of us. I see the staff agree, but we really have to change the tone on how we're going, because those pressures are going to continue. And this automation of no resolution just compounds itself, which continues to add pressure to all of us and to all the providers in the room. So I'll be coming. I know many committee members know that I prepared direction to staff that relate to my last little statement here.
Thank you, Councillor Fleury. Councillor Kakish.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to pick up on just the last points that Councillor Fleury made with regards to the newcomers, particularly the Syrian newcomers, the 2,200 plus that we have in the city of Ottawa, as well as some of the recent Haitian Americans that came over the border as well, that put some pressure on some of them. I know went back, and there was some work that was done in Cornwall, I believe, where they set up a stadium there for them. So can you speak about that? My sense is generally, most of the Syrian newcomers that are here now have been housed and seem to be doing okay from a housing perspective. But what impact have those new Syrian newcomers and have on these numbers that we have before us today, as well as some of the Haitian Americans that came as well with some of the changes with the legislation in the States that was coming from the president there?
Madam Chair, so certainly what we didn't see with the Syrian population that was resettled is we didn't see very many of the Syrian people need to access any of the family shelter services. It was less than 5, if that. And certainly we didn't really see anybody destabilize at the month 13 part where they transitioned onto Ontario Works. Certainly we started tracking in August of last year the increase of refugee claimants from the U.S., Haitians, people from Congo, Burundi. There were many, many different communities that were represented there. We do know that quite a number made their way there. It continues still. We provide updates. I believe we've gone to monthly updates now. So we do know that over 300 households have presented themselves requesting emergency shelter placement. We've diverted some of those households. All of the singles were referred to the singles family shelters, and we've placed, I believe it was 48 families of that particular group. And
I know you work closely with those shelters. How are they doing now? I know there was a period where they were completely at capacity, and they were having to sometimes even ask their friends or family members to host some of these people. So how is the relationship with those shelters now, and how is that moving forward?
Madam Chair, so certainly over parts of the summer and into the fall, we were very much at capacity, both with the family shelters and with our contracted partners that deliver family shelter services, the YMCA and Catholic Centre for Immigrants. And there was a lack of motel rooms because of the 2017 celebrations. So that impacted our capacity to be able to respond. But that situation has improved into the new year. So we do have capacity.
Okay, so in terms of trends moving forward, there's nothing, no peaks that we're foreseeing at this point in time in terms of numbers for Ottawa?
Madam Chair, there's no peaks that I have personally heard of, but I do know that there's talk that we will continue to see waves of refugee claimants from the U.S. as President Trump ends temporary protected status for a variety of different groups. And I certainly think, if I'm quoting it accurately, that the federal government has increased our immigration targets for this year. So I don't think we're out of the woods. I think we'll continue to see a steady flow.
Okay.
Thank you.
We talk a lot about the people that are on the list and the people that are there now as well. But, how do we deal, or what are we doing in terms of people that are moderate to low income and preventing those people as well from moving on to the waiting list as well? How much work or effort or energy is going towards that part? People that may be at risk at some point in the future.
Madam Chair, so we certainly do invest in housing loss prevention services. We've coordinated a lot of our services with Action Logement and Housing Help. We also provide housing benefits that are delivered by Employment and Social Services. We have about $7.7 million in housing benefits. So for people who are experiencing housing insecurity in the community, they're precariously housed, and they run into a rental arrears situation or a utility arrears situation, they are able to access benefits to maintain their housing so that they don't have to lose their housing and end up within the family shelter system.
So there's no big numbers there that we would be worried about, or are there big numbers of people that are right on the cusp that may change the numbers in a significant way in Ottawa?
Madam Chair, in looking at the number of families from 2014 to 2017 who destabilize locally and lose their housing, that percentage has remained pretty consistent at about 19 to 20%. So it's consistent across the board. So I don't think we anticipate anything more than what we normally see at any given year.
Okay. We talked a bit about data management, and some of the delegations spoke about that too, and I've heard assurances, I think, from most of you that we do have a good system in place, but I'm just curious, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but what's the Hamilton model or the other model that was mentioned earlier? Are you familiar with that, and what are they doing differently in terms of tracking or data management that we're not?
Madam Chair, from what I remember of reading the Hamilton model, Hamilton was one of the early participants in the 20,000 Homes campaign, which is an initiative of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. We're also part of the 20,000 Homes campaign. And that campaign, I believe it's like Google Sheets that they use to manage their data. I don't think it's a sophisticated technology that's been built to manage their data, but so that is, that's what I do know.
Okay, so on that front, we're streamlined. Everything is where it needs to be. There's no more changes or investments that need to be done on that front?
No, there's no more, Madam Chair, there's no more changes. I think we have good data management tools. I mean, like any community, we need to evolve. I would love to invest in a built homeless management information system, but that's a couple years away.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you clarify for me how rent supplements versus the housing supplements are allocated? Because we see a significant number of rent supplements are given compared to the housing ones. So can you just clarify that and how that's done and why the discrepancy between the two?
Madam Chair, to be eligible for rent supplements, you have to be on the centralized wait list for social housing, and a rent supplement is just another form of rent geared to income housing. We've been providing rent supplements for a number of years. We had specific provincial funding that was for rent supplements. So it's an agreement with a landlord for a specific unit. People pay 30% of their income, and the rent supplement program, we supplement the difference up to the average market rent for the unit. Housing allowances were a new foray for us. We started delving into the housing allowance world with the 2011 Housing and Homelessness Investment Plan. So it is a portable subsidy that an individual can receive or can be paid to a landlord, which lets you to have choice in the private market and lets you move around with it. So right now we have a tiered housing allowance program. It's $250 plus $50 for each additional family member. However, in our current Housing First program, we've recognized that the $250 is not adequate, certainly for single people. So with some new money from the province, we've increased that to up to $500.
My final question is with regards to the Green on Social Housing program, and I'm just curious a bit about that in terms of are we going to have any role in that, or is that going to be something that goes to Environment Committee? Is there going to be a contribution from the city, and if so, at which level would that be coming from?
Madam Chair, so that is a new program at the provincial level, which will be delivered through Housing Services Corp. I believe it's $25 million a year. We're putting in a business case. It's targeted toward smaller housing providers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're fairly confident. We put together excellent business cases and attract a lot of money all the time that will get what we're asking for out of that $25 million.
So there's no plans for it to come to committee at some point, or is it just something that's being done at the staff level under delegated authority?
It's being done at the staff level under delegated authority.
Okay, but are we able to get updates on that, or will you be sharing information as that moves through the process?
Yes, we will.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to staff, Councillor Taylor, and all the delegations that came out today.
Thank you, Councillor Kakish. Councillor Shirelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, the Veterans Affairs Canada has talked about the rising number of homeless vets across the country, and particularly in our urban areas. And it talks about the resources and cooperation that they want to do with cities. I was wondering if you could outline to what extent we're involved in that.
Madam Chair, so we do have at Housing Services, we do have a relationship that we developed with Vets Canada. So we've worked closely with them when they've done some of their boots on the grounds walk and identified people who are veterans and living in the shelters. So we've helped with some connections there. We have a looser relationship with Soldiers Helping Soldiers, who is another organization that's working to identify veterans who may be experiencing homeless here locally and broker them to the right supports. So we do have Vets Canada that will be participating with us in the point in time count.
Okay. Secondly, these are from 3 different areas, but we have our older adult plan where we're supposed to be tweaking and tailoring various parts of our operation to the growing number of seniors. So what happens when homeless people become seniors? How do we treat them differently? Where do they go?
Madam Chair, through the new affordable housing development that we're funding under the 10-year plan, a specific percentage of capital funding that we receive from the federal and provincial governments annually is allocated towards seniors. So today we've got a number of seniors projects that are under construction. For example, with Ottawa Community Housing, we are building, I think, one of the first seniors hubs in Ontario. It's on Merivale Road. Recent seniors projects also include Eastern Ontario Christian Seniors Co-op on Viewmount. There's about 70 units there. And a lot of the supportive housing that we fund does include seniors as well. So we're trying to make sure that we have a minimum number of seniors options in the affordable housing portfolio to accommodate people as they age.
So do we have projects that are just seniors?
There are some projects that are just seniors, and some projects we would call them mixed composition communities. So where we have larger buildings, we would dedicate a minimum number of units in those buildings to seniors as well.
So do we have people moving from homelessness into those?
Yes, we could have people moving from homelessness into the seniors units, yes.
Okay, and you talked about the number of people that were eventually housed in the last couple of years. And is there any follow-up to that once they're housed? Like a year later, do you find out if they're still there, or did they go somewhere else? Or are they back on the street?
Madam Chair, so we have housed the 519 people. 333 of them are still actively receiving supports, and another 151 have graduated. So when people graduate, they are at various, stages of housing retention. They maybe have been in their housing 6 months, 12 months by the time they graduate. What we do try and track housing retention to 24 months. It is difficult sometimes when people decide they no longer want services to be back in touch with them to verify their housing status. What we can, but I can tell you that of the 151 that did graduate for the program, only 8 of that particular group returned to shelter. There was another group that left the program before they were deemed ready by their case manager to graduate, and 6 of them returned to shelter, so that's 14 in total. And once people return to shelter, we quickly try and re-engage them, certainly because they've just recently had success in housing.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Chair. 2 sets of questions for you. The first, I want to reconcile some of the differences I heard this morning in terms of how the community has portrayed the John Howard Society buildings as not being supportive housing or housing first, rather, I guess, a group home context. My understanding is that those who are moving into the new building in Mechanicsville will have individual leases and that they are actually tenants. Can you help me understand some of the different messaging I'm hearing here?
Madam Chair, so certainly the 2 John Howard buildings, the Rita Thompson residence on Gardner and the new Carruthers building, are absolutely supportive housing, and we do include people whom we move who are chronically homelessness. We do include those people who move into supportive housing as an outcome under our Housing First program. I think there's a difference of opinion. Certainly when people talk about housing first and being true or having true fidelity to the housing model, to the Housing First model, they talk about that people should only live in scattered site apartments. That's what people, that's where people want to live. That's the best choice for people. We need to give people the opportunity to try it out. We know, though, that for about 10 to 15% of people that scattered site approach is not going to be able to sustain it over the long term. So we deliberately started to invest in options back in 2013 to create supportive housing for those people. So we're very proud of our supportive housing investment. So I think it's just a difference in opinion about what is true housing first. And the majority of our people that we are working with do move into private market housing or social housing, about 67%. But we do create options for others who need more intensive 24/7 supports.
Right. And we know that some of the folks who move into JHS or Cornerstone or any number, some of them will probably live there for a very long time, but many others will move on to other housing. So, and that's actually a great segue because from what I heard from Tim Aubry, one of the standards of the pathways is a certain density. He mentioned 20%. As sort of an ideal amount in any given project. Let me take just sort of one step at a time because this is relatively new to me and I want to make sure I understand it. What we call Housing First, generally recognized, is the pathways to housing is sort of the gold standard if you want to call yourself Housing First. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, yes, that is correct.
Okay, and that is a very specific description of Housing First that has 38 different standards to which it should adhere?
That is correct.
Okay. And so we are proposing to compare our Housing First strategy to those 38 standards, which if you were doing it, that is a fidelity assessment?
That is correct. It's called a fidelity assessment.
And the advice that we've received today is to do that fidelity assessment by experts in doing that. For example, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness would be one party that could do a good fidelity assessment.
Yes, certainly we would go external to have an assessment, a fidelity assessment done, and the Canadian Alliance in Homelessness has a technical training and assistance program, and they do offer fidelity assessments. They're one party that does, yes.
So by what mechanics, so you are getting set to do a fidelity assessment that would be delivered to council when?
We'll be doing a fidelity assessment as part of our midpoint review. So I think the results of the whole operational review of Housing First, which will include the fidelity assessment, will be part of the midpoint review and come back to council in 2019.
Okay, and if we're going to be procuring a third party to do that, there would be some sort of an RFP put out at some point?
That's correct.
Okay. Will you come back to us at some point to tell us how you're planning on proceeding to do that before you actually do?
Madam Chair, I can. if the committee directs me to do that, certainly, or by way of an IPD, or can I let you know?
Okay, and actually, would you, I don't know if I can share, not sitting on this committee, but I wonder if staff would take that as a direction to report back to us on your proposed steps to doing a fidelity assessment. Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you. And I am sorry, I was listening to the answers that you were providing to Councillor Caucus with respect to the really sudden spike in the number of families. To what do you attribute that?
Madam Chair, what I can tell you is that if we look at the percentage of families who declared themselves as newcomers in 2014, they accounted for 18% of the total number of families. In 2017, they accounted for 38% of the total number of families. So we're just seeing a real spike in immigration, both through just normal immigration channels, and then we have the pressures of refugee claimants from the U.S. Coming to Canada.
Okay.
And we also have people who are relocating within Canada. I mean, they're coming to Ottawa for economic opportunities, families, friends, and there are established, communities here.
Okay. No, and that is good. And I actually share what I've heard from Councillor Furry and others that dealing with the families has got to be a top priority. We have the Richmond Plaza Motel, obviously, in our ward, the Forward Avenue Family Shelter. I see the strain that is putting on the volunteer sector at a very hyper-local level on the Parkdale Food Centre, on the Westboro Food Bank. It has implications beyond just for the taxpayer. As we continue to struggle to house families, that has a strain on the whole NGO sector at both a citywide and a hyper-local level. So let's continue to do that. I'll look forward to hearing your proposals midterm next term of council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Councillor Fleury.
Madam Chair, I'm just going to read the directions, and I want to thank the city solicitor and staff and yourself for your time in helping me draft these. So these will be submitted to the clerk. Direction to staff, emergency shelter use and housing strategies. 1, that staff report on trends in homelessness, including the statistics on the age and gender of emergency shelter users prior to the completion of the midpoint review of the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. 2, that staff provide a monthly breakdown to CPS committee on a biannual basis, including the number of single men, single women, families, and Indigenous clients using emergency shelters for more than 180 days. This report should also include statistics as to details, reasons for clients not being permanently housed yet. 3, that housing services staff report to council ahead of the midpoint review with policies that prioritize families in housing units. Direction to staff relating to the midpoint review. 1, that staff include consultations with members of the public, business community, and academics in their midpoint review of the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. 2, that prior to the completion of the midpoint review for the 10-year housing and homelessness plan, staff produce a housing primer engagement tool for members of the public and elected official, which explain the legislative framework that governs housing, the various funding sources for housing services, and the various priorities for housing. 3, that staff develop a quick response team ahead of the midpoint review to expand the efforts and increase the transition to housing efficiency for families to ensure that they are housed sooner, and bring back to committee and council policy changes to ensure families to move out of emergency shelters sooner, and also by setting a goal for the number of days for the average length of stay in emergency shelters. And then direction to staff relating to memos to back to committee, and this is for the next CPS committee, if possible. That staff prepare a memo that clearly and simply defines the concept of housing first, so that the community, the city, the elected officials are all on the same page when housing first strategies are presented, and explain how it is being implemented under the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. That staff prepare, again, a memo to inform the committee about mechanisms that exist or that could be implemented to ensure that all people experiencing homelessness feel they have equal access to city-funded programs, regardless of religious and spiritual convictions. And 3, that staff prepare a separate motion to council, to committee, that explains the city's role and responsibilities as a service manager under the Housing Services Act, and how the city is meeting all of those requirements.
Okay, so you have lots of homework. Thank you, Councillor Fleury. We'll take those as directions. You're fine with those? It wasn't a motion, by the way, at the end. It's a memo.
Memo,
So
yeah.
I think that was just a
Yeah.
misread. So before we wrap up today, that's all the questions. Before we wrap up, I just have a few comments. One, I wanted to start by thanking the city staff for your presentation here today and for answering all of these questions and for kicking off the refresh of the plan. I want to thank Councillor Taylor for the immense amount of work that you have done on this file and for sticking with us all day today. And I especially want to thank the members of the public who presented today and who I thought gave incredible amount of great suggestions and ideas. And I think the trick over the next 12 months or so is going to be how do we really engage this community and how do we really drill down on this very complex file. And how do we really make a difference? And I found myself sitting here today wondering what kind of a difference can we really make? And is that a difference we can make as a city on our own, or are we part of a much greater organism? And it was something that Ms. Van Buskirk said that kind of made me think about that in answer to a question from Councillor Nussbaum. When he said, well, when we're talking about the incredible costs of housing families in hotel rooms, and wouldn't it just be better to give them a room? And Ms. Van Buskirk said in answer to that, well, but then we have to worry about the people behind. And it really made me think in the climate that we live in the world, complex world that we live in today, in Donald Trump's America, if we were to have a robust housing policy locally that wasn't integrated with the federal and provincial programs, would it mean that more people would come here? And our policy, I believe, is to not turn anyone away. So the better we get, the more likely we are to have growing demands. And it seems like a bit of a cycle to me. And so that, I think, is why we can't solve homelessness locally without having the province and even the federal government really partners in the policy development and the program development. So it's not just the City of Ottawa, but it's every city that has a program that will work so that we're sharing the demands that are growing on our cities. And I don't think we can do it in isolation. That was what I was left thinking today. I mean, I think demands are growing, client needs are complex, funding streams are tied to specific programs, leaving, not so many choices. There are many contributing factors outside the city's control. We're awaiting a clearer vision of commitment from upper-tier governments. There's a lot going on here, and it's not going to be all that easy to figure out where we go next and how we get there. What I would say to the next City Council, because really they will have carriage of this when it comes back, although I certainly think we all want to be involved in the consultations over the next month, is as much as we need to encourage upper-tier governments to be partners with us every step of the way, we as a council at the start of the next term need to clearly articulate our local commitment and what that's going to be. And we have to say it for the sake of the community, we have to mean it, we have to fund it appropriately, because a lot of the suggestions we've heard come with dollars attached to them. And I don't think we can reasonably ask our staff to go and end homelessness for us if we don't have a path, a clear path, and an understanding of what our local commitment to that path will be, as well as clearly a better understanding of what the federal and provincial governments are bringing to the table along the way. And so maybe at the start of the next term, what we really have to do is define our goal again. Is it still to end homelessness? Is that actually a realistic goal, or is it something perhaps a little bit different? Because that may be something that will always be with us to a certain extent. So those are just my thoughts from what I heard today, and I want to thank you all for being here. We're going to receive this report. We received Councillor Taylor's report earlier, and today really the work on updating this plan begins. So thank you very much. Received on the report? Received. Okay. Back to the agenda. So, are there any inquiries? Other business? Okay, before we wrap up, before we adjourn, I just want to take a quick moment to recognize Clara Freer and the work of the Community and Social Services Department. They have been recognized with the 2018 Ontario Age-Friendly Community Recognition Award. This award celebrates Ontario communities and the work they are doing to create age-friendly cities. Under the Older Adult Plan, Ottawa has worked hard to build accessible and inclusive environments for our seniors, and this is something we should be all proud of. So congratulations to Clara and her team. Adjourned? Adjourned.